Hello and welcome back to Da Vinci Tree's online learning. Today is week number 8, day number 4, and today's new piece of information about next year has to do with the Curie Building. So let's do a quick recap on the two buildings at Da Vinci Tree, the Carver Building and the Curie Building, and where their names come from. Students every morning are dropped off at the Carver Building, which is named for scientist George Washington Carver. Born a slave, Carver tore down walls of racial oppression to show that people of any color could become competent scientists. His work in food science continues to benefit us to this day. The second building, where students are picked up every day, is named for Madame Curie, the French scientist whose pioneering work in physics and chemistry won her multiple Nobel Prizes. She tore down walls of gender oppression to show that women could be amazing scientists, and her family still holds the record for numbers of Nobel Prizes. So, as you may have guessed if you were watching week 8, day number 1, kindergarten through 5th grade is being moved into the Carver Building, so you all will be in one place. And 6th grade through 8th grade is being moved over to the Curie Building, so we'll have all of the middle school in one place. Now, in order to fit all of our middle schoolers into this building, we are actually going ahead and we are completely remodeling a room. Now, we're going to show you that room in just a moment, and I think you're going to like it. The layout is really cool. All right, so here we are to the door to our 3rd grade classroom this last year, and everybody in our school's been through this door. Here's last year's classroom for Miss Frank and Miss Frusti in our 3rd grade. Next year it's going to be for middle school. If we go through here, we see the classroom that this past year was for Miss Stubbs in the 2nd grade. This next year, this area is going to be a multi-purpose room for the middle schoolers. Over here we see the Unisphere, which we talked about the other day. Of course, we still have the bathrooms over here. The lights are turned off, so it's a little dark. All right, here's where things are going to get different. So we see coat hooks on the wall that are all going to go away. A supply room here that's going to be opened up. And here is the door that's always been locked, but we're unlocking it now. So this room that's in the middle of being remodeled is our new classroom. You can see there's a lot of windows, and it's nice and wide open. And so this is going to be our 2nd middle school classroom. So starting next year, we're going to have 2 full classrooms and a multi-purpose room just for our middle school 6th through 8th graders. And so we are very excited for it. We are excited to have a small, personalized middle school that is contained in one building, and we are also excited to have all of the amenities in this building, including multiple drinking fountains, bathrooms, and everything else. So we hope you're excited for next year. I know I am. I actually get an office finally, and we are just gearing up and getting ready to go. Okay, everybody, that's it for our tour of the Curie Building. Take care. Well, let's go ahead and get to our Pledge of Allegiance for today. So wherever you are, please take a moment and stop. Stand up at attention. If you're wearing a hat like me, please take it off. Place your right hand over your heart and repeat after me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, hey, well, thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you have a fantastic day of online learning today, and we'll see you again tomorrow. Welcome back to another day of online learning. We're in week 8, day number 4, as you can see over there. I got my new hat for today. It is a traditional Arizona cowboy hat. I'm excited for it. So, let's go ahead and get to what we're working on today. So, we have a lot of breaks today. This lesson, if you are following in real time, is coming out a day late. Oh, good, that's done. And so, I'm keeping it a little bit shorter today, and we are having a break in several subjects. So, we have a break in life skills, current events. We are doing a year of review of NASA for 2019. NASA's done a lot of fun and interesting things this past year before COVID-19, and so we're going to be taking a look at some of that. History, which is going to be the main bulk of our video today, we're going over the Spanish-American War. I go into some detail talking about the state of naval affairs for the United States during this period of time, and of course we talk about my favorite, Teddy Roosevelt, a little bit. In literature, we're reviewing chapter 24, which was a pretty easy chapter to review. Pretty much only a few things happened. And then tonight you'll be reading chapter 25. And then in science, you're just answering these 3 questions. That's it. And in math, we're taking a break for today, so you don't have to do any of that. All right, let's go ahead without further ado and jump on in. Hey everybody! So, in the year 2019, NASA did a lot of great things. And so, since we're talking about the Artemis project or program now for our current events, and talking about humans going to the moon very soon, I thought it'd be a good idea to look back and also talk about some of the other things that NASA does. So, one of the cool things about NASA is it is a government agency that does so much and is known worldwide and is so greatly respected and has so many new technologies that touch so many like corners of our lives. But it functions on such a small portion of the American government's budget. And so just to give you an idea, NASA's budget is around $22 billion a year. $22 billion a year is less than half of 1% of America's budget. So if you look at the recent stimulus, we had a $3 trillion stimulus that went out to Americans because of the COVID-19 stuff. And so that package was over, it was something like 200 times the budget of NASA. And so NASA's able to do so much with so little. And a big part of it recently is that they've started contracting their logo out for swag. And so when you go to the store, like a lot of us like to buy NASA shirts and we buy NASA like jeans or hats and stuff like that. And so kind of one of the cool things is our love of NASA and just the cool things that they do actually helps fund NASA because they get money when we buy those products. And so it's kind of a backhanded way of supporting our space program. So today you are to click on the link on the website, and there's a 8 or 9 minute long video that talks about everything that NASA did in this past year. And remember, they're doing all of this with less than a half of 1% of America's budget, and yet they're still able to help so many people and come up with so many neat innovations. And again, we're sending people to the moon in a couple of years, and they're able to do it all on such a small budget. If any of you ever get the chance to work for NASA, that'd be super cool. Definitely send me a postcard and maybe do a video interview with me so my students in a couple of years can appreciate that too. All right, guys, let's go take a look. Hey everybody, so in American history today we are talking about the Spanish-American War. It was a very short war fought between Spain and the United States, and it was fought mostly on the island of Cuba that the Spanish had occupied long before. And so there's a lot to say about this period of time. The Spanish-American War was extremely interesting because the Undersecretary of the Navy, or the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, was a fella who we've talked about quite a bit named Theodore Roosevelt. And he basically quit his job and he was like, hot dang, I'm going to go fight someone. And he recruited a bunch of volunteers that he paid for himself. They trained together. They called themselves the Rough Riders. And hot dang, he got on a boat and they were like, yeah, let's do this thing. And they did. And they were very successful. And so that was one aspect of it that was really strange. But there's a lot of other things that go into it. So briefly,
the European powers had become more and more imperialistic, meaning the Europeans had started more and more to build empires and overseas colonies, and they were gathering a lot of steam with this. Now, America, at this point in time, we functioned under something called isolationism, which means that we kept to ourselves and we were cool with that. It's a little bit like today we're seeing a policy with a lot of conservatives in our country for America first. It's a little bit more of an isolationist policy going back to that, where America really focuses more inward rather than outward. And so we've been doing that for many years. In fact, that was a policy that was first instituted by George Washington. In his farewell address, he said, hey, don't get involved with other European powers or other countries. Stick to your own. And I'm paraphrasing, of course, right? But America had always done that, and we were fine doing that. And so around this period of time, the Europeans were branching out and doing all these crazy things and starting all these colonies. And so in the 1890s, there was a lot of talk within Americans, American like political and business circles, saying, hey, should the United States also be preparing its army and navy to be able to colonize, or at the very least, in case we get tangled up with any Europeans, should we be able to take them, go toe-to-toe with a European superpower? And the last great war that we had in America was the Civil War back in the 1860s, which ended, 1865-ish, right? And so in the 1890s, we're 25 years past that. So it's still recent enough where people hurt from it, but it was far enough in the past where the young people hadn't even been born, right? And so at this point in time, you had a fresh group, a next generation of Americans after the Civil War. And another thing that had happened was with the advent of ironclad ships back in the Civil War, when we slapped a bunch of iron plating on ships, the Europeans had taken that idea and they ran with it. And the Europeans had like super advanced navies, even today what we would consider to be pretty modern ships. And so in the 1890s, Americans were like, hey, you know what? If we ever go to war with a European country, we're going to get our butts kicked. Like kicked really hard, because there's not a single ship in the American Navy that can take on one of the ships from these European powers. We just can't do it. And that was in the early 1890s, late 1880s. That's what the American generals and the leaders decided. They're like, you know what? We are so far behind that we are completely out of this game. In fact, they even got together and they publicly said, or I don't know if it's public or private, but we know about it today. The American generals said, if we ever get in a war with a European country, our ships are good enough to sink their trading vessels, their merchant ships. We can do that. But even some of their merchant ships might be able to take out our naval ships. And so it was really bad. And so what we finally decided on, we had a wake-up call. So, South America, we considered to be part of our neighborhood, okay? The United States of America had a neighborhood, and the Europeans were not to mess with our neighborhood. It was the Monroe Doctrine. And so people in North and South America, including Canada, Mexico, Guatemala, Argentina, Brazil, all of the countries in North and South America, that was the United States' hemisphere. That was our neighborhood, and you don't mess with us. So, and the Europeans were pretty cool with that. Like, some of the Europeans still had colonies, like Portugal and Spain still had colonies, but they all had pretty good understandings with the United States that they weren't going to mess with us. We leave them alone, and they leave us alone. And so things were good. Until Brazil actually started advancing its navy to the point where it was a threat. The Brazilian Navy got this ship, I think it was called the Richelieu or something like that, and it was a ship that they bought from Europe. And this one ship was so advanced that it could take out anything in the United States Navy. Isn't that weird to think about? A Brazilian naval vessel was powerful enough to take out any ship in the American Navy. Whew. So that was a wake-up call for the United States. And what it did was it forced our Navy to start building more and more powerful ships. And the two ships that we started with were the Maine and the Texas. And you might be saying, hey, Mr. Roll, you're taking forever. I don't know why you're talking about all this ship stuff, right? Well, it's because the Maine was really critical in the starting of the Spanish-American War that you're going to be reading about. And our reading through Khan Academy, although it's good, it doesn't really talk about the fun stuff. And so the United States started building these ships, the Maine and the Texas, but we really stunk. The United States was so far behind in shipbuilding, and we didn't have the right people in place to build modern warships. And so this ship, which had probably taken between a year and 3 years to build, took 9 years to build. So we started building the ship, and then we finished it like 9 years later. And so America had the right idea. We needed to make a modern Navy. But a bunch of stuff happened in that 9 years, a bunch of advances in military technology. And so by the time the Maine was built to counter the threat of Brazil, okay, by the time the Maine was actually built and we launched it, it was already largely obsolete, because we spent so long trying to build it, and we only started trying to build it because we were afraid that Brazil was more advanced than we were in terms of our military. Now, despite this, the Maine was a beautiful ship, and let's talk about some of the cool things about it, and then some of the problems that it had. So here's the Maine, okay? Now, we're entering an age in history where we can actually see photos of the things that we're talking about, which is kind of cool. And so this is taken, well, this photograph was taken in 1898 right there, and but it was accessed from the Library of Congress in 2016, right? And so the Maine was this beautiful ship, and they had a lot of cool ideas to it. And so the Maine had, I believe, around 300 sailors, so around 300 pretty much all dudes lived on this boat. And so it was steam powered. You see that right there. It used coal to create steam, and the steam would push it along. But it was still long enough ago where they had sails. And so if ever they ran out of coal or something happened and they were trying to save some fuel, they could use their sails, and they could be like a sailboat because it was that long ago. And you see the front, they had this really beautifully done American icon up there. Now, the thing about the Maine that was really interesting, so they had the Maine and the Texas, these two boats that are not exactly sister ships, but kind of, sort of, right? So the Maine actually had these weird protrusions on the side of the boat, and the protrusions were interesting and unique in some ways, but they were also really, really problematic. And so they were part of the reason that the Maine really stunk by the time it was launched, right? And so, again, let's see, Wikipedia has the blueprints here. Let's take a look at the blueprints, okay? Oh, this is a political cartoon from after the USS Maine was sunk, okay? Oh, this is the Brazilian boat, the Riachuelo, that caused the Maine to be built. This was the boat that Americans were so afraid of that we were like, hey guys, it's time for us to build some real ships here too. Again, we weren't concerned about the Europeans, but if even the Brazilians had really kick-butt boats, we needed to too, right? Oh, here we go. Here is a schematic, and I have to zoom in, okay? So do you see the protrusions, and they're called I think they're called sponsors or something like that. These protrusions, right? They're kind of awkward. So you see the center line of the ship, okay? The center line of the ship right here where I'm waving the mouse, I hopefully you can see that, right? That's the middle, obviously. And then if you look at the center of gravity, it goes down the middle right there too, okay? If you think about the center of gravity on a boat, if you were cutting a hot dog, you'd cut it slice it right down the middle so you get two equal halves. That's where the center of gravity is, yeah? That's where you're supposed to put the guns on a ship. Well, Mr. Roll, why are you supposed to put the guns of the ship down the middle of the ship? Well, kids, you're supposed to put the guns of the ship down the middle of the ship because guns are really heavy. And when guns fire, it's just like we're learning about Newton's laws, yeah? For every force or for every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. So kids, whenever these giant turrets, these giant guns fire, there's always this big kickback, all right? And also, because these guns are so heavy, if you put them at weird positions on the boat like that, and then you get the boat stuck in a storm, the boat is going to rock and turn in really weird ways. And so the day the Maine was launched, it was already obsolete because, one, boat technology had advanced so much in 9 years that the Maine was too slow to be a really competent ship. Thing number two, the newer ships that had been designed after the Maine had begun, because again it took 9 years to build, all were much lighter than the Maine as well, and they had a new kind of steel. I think it was called Harvey steel or something like that. And this new steel was a lot lighter than the steel that the Maine had, but it was just as protective. Thing number three, even though the Maine's guns were big, the new ships that had been designed after it had larger guns. These battleships were faster, lighter, and had bigger guns than the Maine. And so the day the Maine was launched, it already wasn't that useful. In addition to that, these weird bulbous outcroppings for the Maine's guns, actually, when the Maine was ever in rough seas, these bulbous outcroppings actually tipped the boat. So the boat would tip, and it would take on a lot of water whenever there was a wave. And so this was an awkward ship. This was like the Steve Urkel of boats. I don't know if you guys get that reference. But, you know, and if the boat's guns were, if one gun was trained in this position and the other gun was trained outward, the entire boat would tip. It was really bad. The only cool thing about these guns that I thought was kind of neat, and this is what they were going for. If you look there, the gun, see that right there, guys? The gun is on a swivel. And so the gun can face all the way forward, or it can turn around and go all the way backwards. So literally, like if you're looking at it from above, everything here, the gun can hit everything on one side of the boat or anything on the other side of the boat. So that was like the one cool thing about them, okay? So all of that is to say, the Maine had a flawed design. It was not the best ship ever. In fact, it was barely good. And the ship was made out of a knee-jerk reaction for America to try to catch up with everyone else. And so, again, when we fast forward to the Spanish-American War, the Cubans and the Spanish are at loggerheads. The Cubans are trying to gain their independence from the Spanish, and so things are not going well. So we have this boat called the Maine, and it's a really beefy boat. It has lots of cool weapons, but it's really not that useful. It's not useful in fighting European powers because we built it and it took us too long, so it's really awkward. And so we send our awkward boat that looks pretty into Havana Harbor in Cuba to just keep an eye on things. They're there to observe, all right? While it's in the harbor, this boat, which is awkwardly built, not really great for actually making war, but good enough for observation missions. While it was in the harbor, this boat is just chilling. It's not doing anything. And so what we found out in 1974, again, like 75 years after this, or 70 years after this actually happened, okay, the boat is sitting in the harbor, and there's a problem with the coal that it uses. It used a form of coal that gives off methane, and methane is really explosive. And so while sitting in the harbor, somehow, maybe a sailor on board lit a cigarette or something like that, somehow the coal was ignited. And the methane collecting in the coal, in the room that had the coal inside the boat, exploded violently, ripping a giant hole in the boat and causing the death of over 2/3 of the crew, sinking the ship. Now, the Navy immediately launched an investigation into what sunk the ship. And the Navy the formal conclusion of the United States Navy about a month after this happened was that there was a mine in Havana Harbor, and the boat hit the mine, and the mine exploded. But many naval engineers and scientists actually thought it was just an accident with coal, and the Navy kind of made them, for lack of a better term, kind of shut them up. But then in the 1970s, there was a re-inquiry into what actually happened, and using better science in the 1970s, they were able to confirm that the initial theory of the coal was like 90% the right one. And if the USS Maine had hit a mine in Havana Harbor, we can kind of tell from the context clues at the time that the mine was not placed there. If it was a mine, we don't know if it was. We think it was the coal, and we're 90% sure it was the coal. But if the other 10% is correct and it hit a mine, the mine was not there necessarily to blow up the Maine. The mine was probably there just as a result of the Spanish and the Cubans fighting each other. So America was never formally attacked by the Spanish or the Cubans. But that didn't matter. So after the Maine exploded, for reasons that were not really necessarily the fault for either the Cubans or the Spanish, the United States, seeing this as an act of aggression and not really listening to cooler heads, decided to declare war on Spain. And in our declaration of war on Spain, we were the American public wanted to make sure that we did not become imperialists like Spain, because America, we are a democracy. We don't go around colonizing everyone. Oh, no. And so we decided at that point that we would not, I repeat, not make Cuba part of the United States. We would go down there and we would fight for the Cuban people, and we would help them retake their land from those naughty, dirty Spanish. And once we kicked all those Spanish out, we would give the land back to Cuba, because we Americans do not colonize. And so we actually passed an act of Congress that said we will not colonize Cuba when we kicked the Spanish out. And we didn't. We didn't colonize Cuba. We gave it back to the Cuban people. But when we conquered Cuba, we also took over Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and one other. I forget. And guess what? We kept those three. But Cuba, we gave back to the Cubans. But the other three that we got, whoopsie, we kept them. And today Puerto Rico is still a main territory for the United States because of the Spanish-American War. Kind of fun history, isn't it? So even to this day, we Americans are a fun and interesting democracy, and we make these weird choices, and they lead to conclusions that you couldn't see coming right away. And so this whole thing is kind of part of that. Now, next year, we are actually beginning our American history with these events. So American history begins at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, because I love this period of time. You get these amazing reporters, and we start to see women really taking the reins in American social life, like with Ida Tarbell and the Muckrakers. They were awesome. And again, we get Theodore Roosevelt, who I love talking about. He's so interesting. You get Taft, who was just like this really great man. He was a great example of what Americans could be if they give up their racist ideas and just, try to follow what is true and good. And so we get all these really cool people in there. So we're going to be talking a lot about this next year if you're in my 7th grade going into 8th grade. And so I'm going to leave a lot of that on the table, and I'm going to stop talking today because I've already talked for too long, because this is a subject that excites me. So I apologize it's gone so long. Please read the article about the Spanish-American War today, and tomorrow you have the practice quiz from Khan Academy. All right, thanks, guys. Oh, put it up here. All right, everybody, we're talking literature right now. And so in literature, you're supposed to read chapter 24. Chapter 24 is, it is an unapologetically good chapter for Tom. And so after Tom's very brave testimony on the stand against Joe, Joe has fled the scene, and everybody in town is hailing Tom as a hero. And so he is doing very well. Everybody is super happy and excited with him, and so he has a great day until he goes to bed, and all he can think of is Joe coming back and killing him. He is afraid, and the townspeople and their detectives and their police, nobody can find him. And so Joe is on the run, and Tom is running scared. So anyway, that was just a brief review of chapter 24. Make sure that you get your 5 times each words in and your dictionary definitions to Mr. Barbero for that. And your homework for tonight is to read chapter 25. All right, let's go ahead and jump back into science. All right, folks, as you know, science is the last subject for the day today because we are keeping the video a little bit short. I'm sorry I'm getting it out a day late again. And so again, trying to give you a little bit less to do. Please make sure that you're answering those questions and emailing them into Mr. Barbero for credit. The questions can be found on the website, and just got to get those done, get those in, and you're good to go. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's get those questions done, get them into Mr. Barbero about basic machines, and then we'll continue on with our reading tomorrow. Thanks.